Today, I want to welcome Jim James. He has built businesses from a suitcase over the last 25 years using public relations. He started EastWest Public Relations in 1995 and has opened offices in Singapore, China, India, and the UK, serving over 500 clients. In China, Jim set up the business as the official importer of Morgan Motor Company sports cars, held the position of interim CEO of Lotus, and was the founding president of EO Network Beijing Chapter. That's the entrepreneurial organization. He established the British Business Awards and was the vice chair of the Chamber of Commerce. He returned to the UK in 2019 and hosts the Unnoticed Entrepreneur. He has a book by the same title, and he has a radio show by the same title. And now he uses tech to help people get noticed. Jim, welcome.
Craig, thank you for the very, very kind introduction. Good to see you.
It's good to see you. And just so everybody knows, I was on your podcast, not that long ago. And I remember connecting about China because I've traveled a lot in China, but you've lived there and you've run businesses there. Tell us about that.
Yes, Craig. Yeah, and you were a wonderful, wonderful guest on the show, and thanks for inviting me to be on your show. I moved to Asia first of all in 1995, as you mentioned, to start a PR business in the music business, actually, music and IT. And then 2001 saw China was acceding to WTO, and it all looked like it was going to be fantastic. So I moved there 2004 to study some Chinese. And then 2006, up sticks from Singapore and same suitcase, actually, from the first move, went to Beijing and started EastWest Public Relations there. And, over the next couple of years, really, fell in love with China and all the things that it had to offer there, not least the opportunities. And it was really a thriving time to be there. And of course, we had the Olympics in 2008 and, met my wife. We had our first daughter and then started to import Morgan sports cars because we actually bought the first one, took it into China as a company car for my public relations company. And people liked it so much that I thought, why don't I do the business of importing it? So I lived there for 13 years in Beijing and traveled around a fair amount, had a few different roles, as you've mentioned. And it was really a fascinating time, Craig. Came back to England 2019, just in time to escape COVID.
So help me figure out the dates. So if I take 13 and subtract it from 2019, I don't get 95.
Oh, no, because I was in Singapore first. Singapore 95 to 2006. And then 2006 through to 2019 in China. So kind of I did Singapore first because we consider that Asia light. It was the kind of the easy choice to start with. But in 95, yeah, it was the beginnings of Asia opening up.
And I was one of the reasons I was interested. I'm trying to think the first time I was in Beijing, and I think it was 2000. And there are a few cities I've seen change as rapidly as Beijing. And, and I haven't been back there for a number of years. Obviously, you've been there a lot sooner than I have, a lot more recently than I have. But what was your take on the change that you saw going through Beijing?
Well, Beijing changed on lots of different levels, Craig, really. But, overall, it was an amazingly sort of dynamic time. It changed architecturally, the whole of Chang'an, the main street where it goes down to Forbidden City, for example. That went from being some amazing buildings down towards Tiananmen Square to getting this sort of ribbon effect, looking more and more like sort of Chicago or New York with these high rises being built. But also we had the infrastructure. So we had new airports being built. We had new railway systems being built. We also had the social architecture of new restaurants and new cinemas and shopping centers and new schools. It became a very livable place, to be honest. Great infrastructure, good public transport, good private transport, great food. But with that as well, Craig, came terrible pollution.
Yeah.
And so, we would have an AQI, an air quality index, on some days of 380, right? And you really couldn't see across the street. And it was cement dust, it was coal dust from Shanxi province, it was pollution of, they were like, Beijing at one stage was 8 million people, and then it grew to 22 million people when I was there. And at the beginning, there were like 3 or 4 million cars, and they were selling the best part of 2 or 3 million cars per year. If you think about like that kind of scale, so you could literally look back at your old photographs and see, streets that you could kind of walk across or down. And each year, progressively longer and longer traffic jams at every traffic light, and more people trying to get into the subways. So it was urban congestion, but it was also emotional stimulation and professional stimulation, because there's so many amazing people going there at that time. So, my wife's from Shanghai, but we went to Chengdu, for example, where I had a dealership for the car business. We bought a house in Hainan, or an apartment in Hainan, and just saw it go from, kind of palm trees and sand to being, amazing developments. It was an amazing opportunity to see a society and civilization grow before your very eyes.
Yeah, and Hainan that's an island down in the south, and that's how far, how long of a plane flight is it from Beijing to Hainan?
Yeah, so that's a 3-hour flight. It's, it's on the same latitude as Vietnam. Wow. Right. So people forget, it's like crossing from New York across to LA is, I think, 3 hours, isn't it? So, it's a big country, China. People forget it's the same kind of landmass as America, but with 1.4 or 1.2 billion people on it, as opposed to 300 million. Most people live on the eastern seaboard. So it's a bit like most people living from Provincetown down to Key West, because the water and the seaboard of the east is what's inhabitable. Whereas once you get west of Beijing and you get across to Shanxi province, and you really get into kind of more desert, because across from that is Mongolia, Russia, India and the Himalayas, right? So people forget geography, and just the climate of China means that a lot of people live in a littoral, as in like LITTROL, live on the coastal or on the waterways. So has over 100 cities with over 100 million people in it. It's pretty incredible. Over 100 cities with over 1 million people living in them. So the scale of China is fantastic, amazing.
Now, one of the things that happens in Beijing that surprised me the first time I saw it was these sandstorms. What's it? I was not there for one. I was there for the aftermath of one, and it looked near apocalyptic. What's it like to live through a sandstorm there?
Well, I think the answer is you live inside when you're living through it. I mean, you just don't go out. And the car would have, in effect, like a snow coating depth of dust. And so it would just look as though someone had got a big, sprinkler and just shook red sand over everything. So yeah, it's pretty amazing actually how it all just gets lifted up and just shipped east from Mongolia. And for the children, of course, it meant being indoors. And when they had SARS, China was already very prepared for SARS, because with pollution and things like the Sahara Desert, the Mongolian sandstorms, people had masks. People were used to working, remotely, because China has these moments of kind of anti-human existence, climatography and pollution. Having said that, China then did a lot of work to crack down on this. So it started to shut down factories in and around Beijing, for example. It started to plant out trees. So massive, massive tree planting programs, forestation programs across China, on a scale that isn't really matched anywhere else around the world. Move to electric cars, for example, as we've seen in China, has been much quicker than anywhere else. So the Chinese, in fairness to them, have been very, very assertive about taking control of that kind of environmental issue.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that. That's good to hear. Now you built entire teams in China and in the Far East. And what was that like? I would imagine as a Westerner, there were a few surprises.
Yeah, I maybe a couple of different team sets I was responsible for. So with my own company, with the PR business, I moved from Singapore to China. So I had a Singapore team and a Beijing team. And then I opened an office in India, which, by the way, I don't recommend in one lifetime. You try and set up businesses in China and India in one lifetime. It's foolish, really. But I had some people in India who wanted to start the business and wanted to use the brand, and so it seemed like it'd be a good idea at the time. Intercultural communications, Craig, is a world into its own. Even if you just have a Westerner and a group of Singaporeans who speak English and, well, ethnically similar, have different backgrounds of being Malay or Chinese or Indian. And then the mainland Chinese, a bit like Americans, you don't really think of yourself as all Americans. Do you? I mean, you think of yourself either a West Coast or an East Coast or, a Texan. And then I went to Chapel Hill, in North Carolina, and there's a huge amount of rivalry between the Tar Heels and the NC State people, right? So in China, if you're building a team, you might have a common language of Mandarin, but there's often distrust between people from the provinces, for example, and the cities. And then you have educational differences. So a big part of building a sort of a cross-cultural team is really about understanding the different places that everyone comes from in the first place before they even get to the table, and that takes a lot of patience and a lot of attention, really. And I built a team as well when I ran Lotus. I found, a huge amount of distrust because people also were looking after their own interests. And when I was running the Lotus business, I wasn't running my own company. I was running the company for someone else. And there's a whole bunch of dynamics that come into play. And that'll happen in any culture, I'm sure, right? If you're running different teams. But the other dimension of running a company or a team in Asia, other than the geography and the culture and the class and so on, is the cultural dimension. And, in the West, the saying is that we're driven by guilt, Craig, right? Because we come from basically a Christian background where we all believe in judgment. Even if we don't believe that we're Christians, underlying societal norms are around judgment and about societal values. In Asia, the view is that people are driven by shame because it's an atheist. It's not a Christian society, right? It's a Buddhist society. So there isn't a higher order. You're judged by yourself. But what really matters in places like China, where they've worked hard to get rid of religion, is around face, about being what we call face, respect for each other. So when you're coming to managing teams, what you find is that the different cultural drivers, one's got guilt, one's got shame. And then in Asia, the way that they implement that kind of social hierarchy is through Confucian logic. And Confucian is this old, Confucius is that the oldest male in society will rule regardless of merit, right? When it justifies emperors, whether it's people like Lee Kuan Yew that managed to stay in power and have his family, or whether it's Xi Jinping, this sort of oldest male. And it's a very stereotype typical and also very sexist. Now, as an eldest male, and often the employer, and as a foreigner, you're given a lot of authority as an owner, as an entrepreneur. And that's great if you want to tell everyone what to do. But you and I both know, Craig, that telling everyone what to do is yesterday's business strategy, especially if you're then going to Singapore to run a team and and India to run a team, you need the team to run itself while you're gone, right? So, so one of the fundamental challenges that I had in the PR business in China and in the car business and in the Lotus business, I was running 3 companies at the same time, was to get the Chinese to not see me as the ultimate authority, to get them to take decisions for themselves. And that was so antithetical to the structure of their societal behavior. So things like leadership training, things like giving people permission to take control and being very explicit about the fact that I was giving them some tangible form of authority, a hat, a shirt, a token for the desk that said, you have some authority now, don't abuse it. So running the teams across different societies and different cultures was very, very interesting. And it took as much time as running the business, Craig, but fascinating.
That's really insightful. And I could see I've studied at a Japanese university. I've lived in Asia. I could see myself easily getting tripped up by that very pitfall, even with my more intimate knowledge than the average Westerner. And that's such a critical insight. And when you were talking about the difference between duty and shame, the other thing that came to mind was the difference, between guilt and shame. Yeah. The other thing that came to mind was duty versus honor. Would you see a similar difference, where honor is valued in the West and duty is valued in the East?
Well, I suppose what the difference fundamentally is whether it's an internal driver or an external driver, isn't it? So it depends if you see duty as being, you have a sense of duty, and do you see honor being internally driven or externally driven? The point being that with the guilt and the shame is that guilt is something that we feel internally. I feel guilty about something, but someone can't make me feel guilty. They might try, but ultimately I can decide, right? But shame is where other people shame you. Other people actively go out and say, this person is not okay, right?
Yeah.
But Asian people have a great sense of honor and a great sense of pride and duty. So I don't know, Craig, whether I would be clever enough to figure out whether those were internal or external. The difference is that what you'll see, for example, in let's say take education. In school in England, you'd never publish a class list. You never publish a list of the children's performance in the classroom, right? But my daughter would come home and they have published in the classroom the rankings of how all the 8-year-olds have done in the maths test, right? And when you go to the evening with the teachers, they go and show you, see how your daughter is doing not compared to her last score. Look how she's doing compared to the other children. That's what I mean about face. So the idea is that you feel embarrassed and therefore you're motivated by embarrassment.
No, and that's a good distinction. Now, you said you had some moment where you felt like your leadership was, kind of put to the test over there.
Yeah, more than one occasion. Yeah, I think leadership in terms of being put to the test, I think that when you say test, I think it's about whether you believe enough in what you're doing to follow through the difficult moments, if you see what I mean. Because as a foreigner, no one questioned me. I didn't have any members of staff ever say, Jim, you're wrong. But sometimes you went through situations where things were not working out properly. I uncovered in Lotus, for example, some goings on that shouldn't have been going on. And people came to talk to me about it. And I thought, crikey, I wasn't hoping to uncover these things. Have I done the wrong thing? I actually kind of was unlocking a room that had some nasty things inside it. And so I was getting a lot of pushback from certain people in the organization who didn't want anyone to go near that room. And so, but you're thinking, well, what I believe to be right is to go down that path. But people are saying, we're management. We don't talk about those things in front of these people. And I was like, well, we're management, therefore we should talk about these things in front of other people, because these are the things that are fundamentally bottlenecks to the company moving forward. So I persevered, and in the end, it all resolved itself. But Craig, I think this idea that sometimes when you're in a foreign land, you don't have the same kind of support infrastructure, and you don't have the same reinforcement because other people around you are not doing these things. So challenge, as much as I think was more internal, ironically enough, we talked about internal, external. Challenge was more like, am I doing the right thing to continue challenging when other people around me are not doing that kind of management technique? It would be easier not to do that.
Well, and what an incredible example, because, I think as we look through time, some of the people that have made the biggest impacts are those that have said, what I'm seeing is wrong, and I'm going to stand against it, despite all pressure to comply. And this is not uniquely an Asian thing.
No, we're seeing that now in America, aren't we, really? I mean, that the desire of some people to do what they believe is right, even though it may not seem to be what everyone else would like to do, for me is one of the hallmarks of a brave leader, right? I mean, we know there are lots of different kinds of leaders, right? But to have the courage of your convictions, almost for me, is one of the definitions of being a leader, isn't it? Right? That if you're living with compromise in yourself, then you can't really be a leader with a full heart. And that's part of what, I personally have always worked towards. And sometimes, at personal cost, but longer term, I think then you can look at yourself, in the mirror.
Absolutely. Now, you left Asia and you moved back to the UK, and it was more than just a geographical transition. You made a big transition.
Yes, Craig. And I think we're referring to the fact that what I do today has really kind of nothing to do with what I did in Asia, right? In Asia, I had a PR business in Singapore and also an internet business there. And in China, we had the car business and a PR business, internet business, and a drinks business actually too. When I came back to England, I was working a little while with half a head and half a mind in Asia. I'd go back to Singapore to do some work because we had COVID, so we couldn't go back to China. But, within a very short amount of time, I really thought, Craig, that I don't want to live my life where I used to be. I want to live my life where I want to be. And in a way, that's the hardest challenge of all as an entrepreneur, because it's easy to carry on doing what you were doing before because it is still working. But there's kind of a diminishing marginal returns from that. And what I realized was that the longer I was away from Asia, I would either, I would start to lose what I knew about Asia, become less and less valuable. I would then need to be an expert to Asians into Europe. And I decided I didn't want to be flying to Asia and missing my children. And I loved the fact that I can take them to school every day and stuff like that. So I decided to sell my PR business in Singapore. We didn't try and keep the car business in China. And I decided to change entirely what I do, Craig. So to go from working with big companies, I decided to start the Unnoticed Entrepreneur franchise, really, or business, which is where I use what I've learned by starting businesses and working with over 500 clients with my PR business. And I would serve entrepreneurs who need that guidance, but can't afford an agency. And so I changed the model from being, one agency with one big B2B client to being me with a podcast and a book and training programs where I can serve, frankly, people who I think need it most of all, which are those great people that have got great ideas, but just don't know how to get scale. don't know how to get a brand. And so that's really what I decided to do. So I dedicated the last 3 years to doing that and building the brand, the podcast, which you've been on kindly, in the book. And ironically enough, Craig, I was thinking about this the other day, the business now really is I listen to people for a living, which is great because I interview people on my podcast like yourself, and I've had over 300 guests now, and they explain to me how as entrepreneurs they get noticed. And I'm able to now be a channel for that information through the podcast, the books, the videos, and share that with other people. So I've really gone from one position where I was selling things to people to really having a business where I get to listen and learn from people around the world, and then just to help structure that and share that with people that I think would benefit from it.
And that is such a service. So help me understand this. So you say PR for people who generally can't afford it. Help me wrap my head around that, because normally when I think about that, I think about an expensive firm, perhaps out of New York, that's going to charge a fortune, and the business will go bankrupt before I'm done paying their retainer.
Yeah, and I think the point really is that public relations and media relations is not for everybody. And what I'm really looking at is all of the tools and the strategies that entrepreneurs can use that are free. And so what I do, I have a Facebook group called the Unnoticed Entrepreneur group. And on my podcast, for example, I have people, Craig, who come on and talk about not just PR, but marketing, the use of a quick response code, the use of tools like Marketing Boost, where you can give someone free hotel rooms, for example. And I'm especially leaning in, Craig, to more and more of the content creation tools that are available through AI, for example. So the challenge with PR agencies, and I ran one myself for 25 years, is we sell companies what we want them to buy from us, right? We sell them a press release, we sell them an interview, but so many companies get that interview and then nothing really happens. So it's not really serving the client, it's serving the agency. There are so many ways that an entrepreneur can get noticed that are free and cost effective. And that feels kind of a much more kind of wholesome lesson that I can share, Craig, with people.
Well, that's a very valuable lesson. There's some people that are very skilled with powerful messages that should get out, and you're removing that barrier for them.
Hey, that's really the idea, yeah. And to try and pull it all together, because what most entrepreneurs don't have is one place to go to find that information. So if you go on Facebook, there's 1,001 ads, take this course, buy this ad, but there isn't a trusted advisor. There isn't one place where it's coming together. And the difference with what I'm doing is I have fellow entrepreneurs explain what they do, Craig, as opposed to me being a journalist or a salesperson explaining what they should do. So the idea, as you've been on the show yourself, Craig, it's people like you explaining how you get yourself noticed, so that another entrepreneur can trust that your advice is advice that they could use and it would be genuine and usable.
Well, thank you for sharing that. How do people reach you? I mean, so you have the Unnoticed Entrepreneur podcast, you've got the Unnoticed Entrepreneur book, and you now have a radio show on Radio Bath. I'm assuming for those in the US aren't intimate with UK geography, Bath is a city in the UK.
Yeah, it's on the west side of England. Yeah.
Okay. And so you have a radio show in Bath.
Yeah, it's a community radio, and started up by a group of volunteers here in the West Country, and so they do a wonderful. It's available on digital radio, actually, so you can find it. Radio Bath. You don't have to listen to it in the Bath, although you could if you wanted to. Bath is a very famous city down here in the West Country. But yet, in terms of getting hold of me, Craig, I'm just jimajames.com is my website. And if they come to my website, jimajames.com, then they can find all the different assets that they want to. I'm also on Linktree at jimajames as well. So one of those two places will get you to everything that I've produced, and welcome really any outreach or connections and any entrepreneurs that would love to come on the show. I would happily have a chat with them.
Well, I do hope people reach out, because that's a ton of value that you're offering to entrepreneurs that will help them promote their business. And Jim, I want to thank you for being on Leaders and Legacies today.
Greg, thank you so much for inviting me on your amazing podcast. I really appreciate you giving me the time to share what I'm doing, and trying to leave a bit of a legacy as you are. So I'm following in your footsteps.
Oh, thank you. You're very kind. All right. Have a good day.
You too.